This video will help you understand your non-qualified stock options and ideally help you pay as little in tax as possible. Hey everyone, if you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. Today I thought it'd be helpful to cover non-qualified stock options. I actually just ran into this with a client the other day where part of her executive compensation is through non-qualified stock options as well as restricted stock units. We already covered restricted stock units the other week, so I figured today we'll cover non-qualified stock options. So we'll cover what are they, how do they work, and how are they taxed, as well as some best practices. So let's jump in. So to understand how these fall into the categories of various stock equity compensation type programs of ESOs or employee stock options, there's incentive stock options and then there's non-qualified stock options. The other week I pushed out a video on incentive stock options. These are not them. To refresh all of our memory on what a stock option is, it's the right to purchase a stock at some set price in the future, regardless of what the stock price is at that point. So theoretically, let's say I have an option that lets me buy a stock for $10 and the stock is currently trading at $20. I can exercise my option, pay 10 bucks, and get a stock now worth $20. Pretty cool. I made a profit immediately and it only cost me 10 bucks. Oftentimes companies will compensate employees with these types of options. It's a cool way to retain some talent. It also helps align the interests of the employees with the interests of the company, namely that the stock price increases. There's going to be three major dates to be aware of. There's going to be the grant date, and that's when your company tells you about these options that they're going to give you. They'll tell you what the strike price or exercise price is, and that's the price that you'd have to pay if you want to buy the stock in the future. They'll also tell you about the vesting requirements. Very common is like a 3-year cliff vest where you can't do anything with these options until 3 years later. But that's the grant date. There's no taxes at this time on the grant date for non-qualified stock options. Next up is the exercise date. And that's the date that you choose to voluntarily exercise your options by turning them from options into shares of the company stock. You might not ever have an exercise date if you choose to never exercise your options. Generally, you'll have 10 years since the date of grant to exercise these options before they become worthless and expire. Keep in mind that if you had like a 3-year vesting requirement after the date of grant, you'd only really have 7 years to decide whether or not to exercise these options and turn them into stocks. Sometimes it's in your best interest to let the options expire worthless. And that would be when the fair market value or the current trading price of the stock is less than the exercise price to turn that option into a stock. To keep it simple, that's essentially like you paying more for the stock to get the stock. You really wouldn't ever want to exercise an option when it's out of the money. And that means when the fair market value is less than the exercise price. On the other hand, if the exercise price is lower than the fair market value, then you might want to look into exercising your option. That's when the option is in the money. The difference between the fair market value at exercise and the exercise price, or the price you paid to exercise the option, that difference is going to be considered ordinary income, and your employer will report that income on your W-2. So not only is that federal income and state income taxes, if applicable, but that's also Social Security and Medicare taxes as well. The nice thing about non-qualified stock options is that bargain element doesn't get factored into any sort of alternative minimum tax calculation. And so even though I went into depth on that in my last video, you won't have to worry about that with non-qualified stock options. That being said, similar to incentive stock options, that bargain element, or the difference between the fair market value and the exercise price at exercise, that bargain element you could consider phantom income because it's money that you made but you don't see showing up into your bank account or anything like that, which means you will have to pay taxes on money that never hit your bank account. And so just like a phantom, you can't see it, you can't touch it, but it's there and you get to pay taxes on it. The third date that we'd want to be aware of in this scenario is the sale date. And that's obviously when you decide to sell the stock. And you may choose to sell it at a profit or at a loss. You may choose to sell it right away, or you may choose to wait. We'll jump into pros and cons there. So from a tax standpoint, the nice thing about non-qualified stock options is they keep planning very simple, where you really don't have much control over how these are going to be taxed. The first tax liability you'll need to be aware of, we just touched on that, the bargain element, or the difference between the fair market value at exercise and the exercise price, that's ordinary income. There's nothing you can do about that. After you've exercised, that begins the countdown to the sale date, and you get to arbitrarily choose the sale date when you'd like it to be. But if you sell the stock within 1 year since the date you exercised, any gain or loss will be considered short-term capital gain or short-term capital loss. If you wait longer than a year since the exercise date, then anytime you sell the stock, it will be considered either a long-term capital gain or a long-term capital loss. As a quick refresher, short-term capital gains rates are always less favorable than long-term capital gains rates, but there might be some reasons why you'd take either the short-term capital gain or loss as opposed to the long-term. It kind of just depends on your situation. But again, non-qualified stock options keep it very simple, where you essentially have two decisions to make. When do I exercise and when do I sell? When you exercise, ordinary income. When you sell, capital gains, either short-term or long-term. So from a best practices standpoint, if you're engineer-minded, you could very much go down the rabbit hole and think of an infinite number of situations for when to exercise and when to sell, if ever. I like to keep it simple and give some broad advice here. If the option is in the money, which means the stock is trading at a price higher than the exercise price, I advise clients most of the time to exercise and then sell that stock immediately. But Chris, why would you exercise immediately? Great question. The reason that it makes sense to me for clients to exercise early is because we want to ideally keep that bargain element as small as possible. And if you're with a company that you think is growing, otherwise you probably wouldn't be working there, you'd prognosticate that the stock is probably going to go up from where it is today, which means your bargain element, or the difference between the exercise price and the fair market value of the stock, is just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. It just means you're going to be paying more and more in ordinary income tax. Whereas if you exercise immediately, you will still pay some tax. There's nothing you can do about that. But now you're in the driver's seat as to whether or not you want to hold the stock, sell it, whatever. The goal is to have as small of a bargain element as possible. Now you could try to time it to where, let's say the fair market value was way above the exercise price, and you're thinking, hey, maybe the fair market value will come down, then I'll exercise, and then the stock will go back up. You could try that. I've never seen it executed well, but technically that's an option for you. I generally advise clients just to exercise immediately, pay whatever the taxes are, and then make decisions on what to do with the stock. Once you've exercised your options, I like to analogize this period of the transaction, the exercise period of the transaction, to restricted stock units. And I'll see if I can get a card put up somewhere. You can go watch that video if you're unfamiliar with those. And I analogize it to restricted stock units because once restricted stock units hit your account, just like post-exercise non-qualified stock options, you've already paid all the taxes you need to get that stock. Whatever the fair market value of the stock is after you've exercised, I would think of that as purely cash. And the question you have to ask yourself is, do I want to invest all of this cash into company stock? If the answer is no, then I'd highly recommend diversifying all or at least a majority of that stock. If the answer is I totally would have taken all my cash bonus and invested it into company stock, well then do nothing because you're already there. Most of the time though, I don't find that people are super comfortable doing the latter. The other neat benefit about exercising immediately is it starts the clock on long-term capital gains. If you wait 7 years after getting access to these options to exercise, and you exercise at the very last minute, well, you still now need to wait 1 more year before you can sell out of the stock and achieve long-term capital gains. Of course, you could sell out of it before the 1 year, and that might be in your best interest, but if you're aiming to pay the least amount in taxes as possible on these transactions, then after you exercise, that's going to start the 1 year calculator, and then after that 1 year, then you could sell the stock and you'd have a long-term capital gain or loss, but ideally a long-term capital gain, which will be taxed at more preferential tax rates than short-term. In a perfect world, if you followed my advice and you exercised and sold the stock immediately, then you would pay your ordinary income tax on the bargain element, which everybody does, and ideally you'd have as little as possible in capital gains or losses to worry about from the day that you exercised the option to when you sold. Now you'd have that money in cash and you can go make informed decisions as to what to invest it into, rather than just planning by default and leaving it inside the company stock. Of course, if you only listen to half of my advice and you exercise immediately and then you don't sell, the worst case scenario is that you get to the 11th month mark, the stock is down further than where you exercised it, and you have to take a loss. But as some of my more sophisticated investors might know, taking a loss with your investments isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world because you can take those losses and offset gains elsewhere or bank them for future years. And of course, you could use up to $3,000 of net short-term capital losses to offset your taxable income. So let's say you've decided that you want to exercise your options as soon as they land in your account. Now you have to figure out how to pay for all those exercise prices, because it's not just the exercise price that you have to pay, it's the exercise price times however many shares that you want to exercise. There's a few different choices you have for how to pay for that exercise cost. I'll do a video on this another time, but it all boils down to two major options. Number one, pay for the options out of your pocket. So reach into your bank account and pay whatever the cost is to exercise these options out of your own money, or use those options to cannibalize themselves, whereby the company exercises all the options, and then the cost it would be to exercise those options, your company just sells shares immediately to pay for that cost. So for example, let's say the exercise price is $10 and the stock is trading at 100 and you've got 10 shares. Well, to exercise those options, you'd pay $100 because that'd be $10 per option times 10 shares. That would cost you $100 of cash to exercise these options. So your company might exercise all 10 and then leave you with 9 and sell one of them, because that $100 that they'd net from selling the one share would be enough to pay for all those exercise prices. There's other options out there, but I kind of boil it down to those two because you pretty much have to make a philosophical decision. Am I going to double down and put more money into this company stock using my cash, or am I going to exercise and sell immediately with as little risk to me as possible and as little cash outlay as possible? If it's the latter, then obviously you'd want to use the plan to cannibalize itself to pay for itself to exercise and sell. And then of course you'd try to sell immediately and then go diversify. So what are your calls to action? Number one, find out if you're entitled to non-qualified stock options either now or maybe at your next promotion. Obviously you'd want to come up with a strategy ahead of time as to when you're going to exercise and when you're going to sell out of these options. You might have some certain price points or triggers that determine whether or not you're going to sell the stock. But of course, if you come up with it ahead of time, you're going to be far less likely to make emotional, spur-of-the-moment decisions as to whether or not to sell the stock if the market starts to fluctuate wildly. So hopefully that was helpful in speaking to non-qualified stock options. Of course, none of this is direct advice to you specifically. You'd want to speak with your certified financial planner to figure out the best course of action. But if you have more questions, you can drop them in the chat below or send me an email. We'll get you squared away. Have a great rest of your week. We'll talk to you later. Bye.